Dom? At 58, Julia Roberts no longer needs the spotlight to validate her. The woman once crowned Hollywood's million-dollar smile has outlived the frenzy, the gossip cycles, the tabloid wars, and the carefully manufactured myths. But behind that luminous grin, the one that lit up Pretty Woman and carried her through decades of box office dominance, there was always something else. Not fragility, not insecurity, something colder, something disciplined, silence. And silence in Hollywood is rarely weakness. It is strategy. Born in Smyrna, Georgia, in 1967, Julia Fiona Roberts did not arrive in Los Angeles as royalty. She came from a fractured family, financial instability, and the quiet understanding that survival was never guaranteed. Fame was not a childhood fantasy. Stability was. When Pretty Woman exploded in 1990, it didn't just make her a star, it reshaped the definition of a leading lady. She wasn't sculpted glamour in the traditional mold. She was expressive, human, unpredictable. America didn't just admire her. It trusted her. But Hollywood has a peculiar way of punishing women it cannot fully control. Through the 1990s and early 2000s, Roberts' career soared. My Best Friend's Wedding, Notting Hill, Erin Brockovich, the latter earning her an Academy Award. She became one of the highest-paid actresses in history. Yet with every success came whispers. Difficult, demanding, intense, too strong-willed, too opinionated. Labels that rarely attach themselves to powerful men with the same consistency. For years, Julia did what veterans of the industry learn to do. She smiled. She played the game. She protected the machine that fed her. Because Hollywood is not just about talent. It is about alliances, leverage, timing. And timing, as she would later suggest, is everything. What makes the recent viral narrative so compelling isn't the names attached to it. It's the emotional architecture. The suggestion that behind the awards, the romances, and the red carpets, there were fractures. Moments when trust dissolved. When professional boundaries blurred. When the very people presented as colleagues or friends became adversaries in subtle, strategic ways. But here's the crucial distinction. The internet thrives on escalation. Nuance does not trend. Conflict does. In interviews across decades, Julia Roberts has been candid about pressure, about public scrutiny, about the brutality of tabloid culture in the 1990s. She has acknowledged missteps in her personal life. She has spoken about heartbreak and media distortion. What she has not done, at least in any verifiable public record, is deliver a theatrical hate list of co-stars. And that difference matters, because the mythology of Hollywood often writes its own scripts. A strong woman becomes cold. A private woman becomes secretive. A strategic woman becomes calculating. When audiences consume a viral video promising a dramatic takedown, they are not just watching gossip. They are participating in the construction of a narrative. So the real question isn't whether Julia Roberts harbors resentment. Any human being in a high-stakes industry inevitably does. The deeper question is why audiences are so eager to believe that beneath the smile lies fury waiting to detonate. At 58, Julia Roberts doesn't appear to be detonating anything. She appears measured, selective, intentional, and perhaps that is more powerful than any exposé could ever be. This is where the story truly begins. If part one was about silence, then part two is about the ecosystem that makes silence necessary. Hollywood is not merely an industry. It is an intricate hierarchy of power, perception, and negotiation. Careers are not destroyed overnight. They are repositioned. They are cooled. They are quietly sidelined. And for someone like Julia Roberts, who rose faster and earned more than most of her male contemporaries in the 1990s, that hierarchy was never going to remain comfortable. By the time she commanded $20 million per film, Roberts was no longer just an actress. She was leverage. Studios built release calendars around her availability. Scripts were rewritten with her in mind. Marketing campaigns depended on her smile filling a poster frame. That level of influence invites admiration, but it also breeds resistance. There's a recurring pattern in Hollywood history. When an actress becomes economically indispensable, narratives shift. She becomes hard to work with. She becomes temperamental. She becomes intimidating. The language is subtle, but the implications are clear. Authority in a woman is often reframed as volatility. Roberts experienced this reframing repeatedly. Directors described her as exacting. Co-stars described her as guarded. Journalists pressed her about personal relationships more aggressively than about craft. Yet in the same era, male actors who negotiated scripts, rewrote scenes, or demanded creative control were labeled perfectionists or auteurs. The viral video suggests explosive betrayals, hidden footage, political sabotage, career theft. But even without endorsing those specific allegations, there is a broader truth worth examining. Hollywood is a negotiation battlefield disguised as glamour. Consider the dynamic of on-screen chemistry. When two actors appear romantically convincing, audiences often blur fiction with reality. Media outlets amplify that ambiguity because it drives attention. But chemistry can become currency. A headline implying romance sells more magazines than a headline about contract terms. For a female lead, that currency can quickly feel less like flattery and more like commodification. Roberts has spoken in past interviews about being reduced to her smile, her legs, her box office appeal. It sounds flattering until you realize the subtext. Your value is aesthetic before it is intellectual. For an actress who fought to produce projects and influence endings, who insisted that female characters have agency beyond romantic resolution, that reduction would not feel harmless. Another dimension is creative ownership. When a script evolves, when casting shifts, when investors intervene, the emotional investment of an actor can be invalidated overnight. In an industry where agencies represent multiple A-list clients simultaneously, conflicts of interest are not theoretical. They are structural. Loyalty bends to profitability. A project tailored for one performer can pivot if another name attracts stronger financing. It is rarely personal, but always feels personal. The psychology of that environment accumulates over decades. Trust becomes selective. Vulnerability becomes strategic. Friendships intertwine with competition. An actor may share red carpets with someone one night and compete for the same award weeks later. Smiles do not guarantee alignment. The video frames certain relationships as outright betrayal. Whether or not those specific incidents occurred, the emotional premise resonates because audiences understand one thing instinctively. Fame magnifies intimacy and magnifies disappointment. A private disagreement between unknown colleagues remains private. A disagreement between global celebrities becomes mythology. By her late 50s, Roberts had transitioned from ingénue to institution. She no longer needed to chase scripts. Scripts chased her. That shift changes perspective. When you're climbing, you tolerate more. When you're established, you recalibrate boundaries. What once felt like a necessary compromise may later look like a violation of principle. There's also the matter of gendered longevity. Male actors in their 50s are routinely cast as romantic leads opposite women decades younger. Female actors in their 50s often confront shrinking lead roles. To sustain relevance, many pivot to producing. Roberts did exactly that. Producing is not just a creative choice, it is a power move. It places you at the decision-making table instead of waiting outside it. And power changes how you speak. If a 28-year-old Julia Roberts had publicly criticized powerful colleagues, the consequences could have been severe. At 58, the calculus shifts. She has financial independence, cultural legacy, and reduced dependence on studio goodwill. That doesn't automatically mean she harbors vendettas. It means she possesses insulation. So when audiences encounter a viral narrative promising a dramatic reveal, they are responding to more than gossip. They are responding to decades of visible tension between star image and industry machinery. The truth may not be as theatrical as a list of enemies. It may be more nuanced, disappointment instead of hatred, boundary setting instead of revenge, selective distance instead of public confrontation. But nuance rarely trends. Conflict does. And that tension between the measured reality of a veteran actress and the explosive mythology built around her is precisely what keeps this story alive. By the time Julia Roberts entered her 40s, the conversation around her had subtly shifted. She was no longer just the effervescent newcomer redefining romantic comedies. She was an institution navigating legacy. And legacy in Hollywood is a double-edged construct. It preserves you in public memory, but it also traps you in a version of yourself audiences refuse to update. The viral narrative frames specific individuals as antagonists, but the deeper antagonist in Roberts' career may have been expectation itself. The industry created America's sweetheart, and once that archetype was cemented, deviation became risky. When she took on darker roles, critics questioned whether audiences would accept her. When she negotiated harder contracts, insiders whispered about temperament. The persona that built her became the persona she had to constantly negotiate against. There is an important psychological dimension here. Long-term stardom requires compartmentalization. An actor must distinguish between personal identity and projected identity. Robert's public image was warmth, spontaneity, accessible charm. Yet sustaining global fame requires calculated restraint, strategic communication, and relentless discipline. The contrast between the image and the operational reality can create internal friction. Consider the economic landscape of the late 1990s and early 2000s. Roberts became one of the first actresses to command salaries equal to or exceeding male co-stars. That milestone was celebrated publicly, but in private, it recalibrated dynamics. Compensation signals power. Power shifts relationships. When one performer's presence determines whether a film is financed, the social equilibrium on set changes. In environments defined by hierarchy, subtle resistance often emerges. It may manifest as creative disagreements, competitive positioning, or media framing. None of these require cartoonish villainy to feel destabilizing. They require only ambition intersecting with ego. The viral script dramatizes episodes of betrayal, moments when trust allegedly fractured. Whether or not those particular events occurred, the underlying theme reflects a broader industry truth. Collaboration in Hollywood is rarely purely artistic. It is contractual, political, reputational. When actors form alliances, those alliances exist within systems of negotiation. Robert's transition into producing illustrates this evolution clearly. Producing is not a vanity credit, it is structural authority. It grants oversight in casting, script development, marketing strategy, and final cut negotiations. For an actress who once depended on directors and studio executives to shape narrative outcomes, producing offered autonomy. Autonomy, however, can unsettle colleagues accustomed to different power distributions. Another layer is media amplification. In the 1990s, tabloid culture intensified dramatically. Robert's personal life, engagements, breakups, marriages became headline currency. The framing was rarely neutral. When male stars experienced similar turbulence, coverage often emphasized passion or complexity. When Roberts did, coverage skewed toward moral judgment. That disparity shapes how professional conflicts are later interpreted. Audiences also underestimate how rumor ecosystems operate. A speculative anecdote repeated often enough begins to harden into assumed fact. A single tense interview exchange becomes shorthand for a feud. Silence, in that context, can be misread as confirmation. Roberts' historical reluctance to publicly litigate personal disputes may have protected her privacy, but simultaneously left space for narrative inflation. As she matured, her film choices reflected recalibration. She moved toward ensemble projects, character-driven dramas, and eventually streaming platforms. This pivot was not retreat, it was adaptation. The entertainment economy itself shifted. Box office dominance fragmented by digital distribution, social media altering celebrity access, prestige television competing with theatrical film. In that new ecosystem, The mythology of grudges functions differently. Controversy can trend globally within hours. Allegations, true, exaggerated, or fabricated, acquire velocity before verification. For a veteran figure like Roberts, viral storytelling attaches to decades of accumulated imagery. Viewers project backward, interpreting past interviews through present narratives. There is also the human element of long careers. Disappointment is inevitable. Collaborations fail. Scripts collapse. Promises evaporate when financing disappears. Creative visions clash. In any high-pressure profession, particularly one blending art and commerce, moments of disillusionment accumulate. To interpret that accumulation as hatred oversimplifies what is more likely a complex mix of boundary setting and self-protection. One must also examine generational contrast. The Hollywood Roberts entered in the late 1980s operated under opaque power structures. Agency politics were formidable. Studio heads wielded disproportionate influence. Conversations about consent, equity, and transparency were less publicly articulated than they are now. Navigating that terrain required strategic endurance. In later years, cultural discourse evolved. Movements emphasizing accountability and workplace ethics altered industry language. A veteran actress reflecting on earlier experiences might reinterpret them through a modern lens. What once seemed merely part of the business might now register as exploitative or disrespectful. That reframing does not require dramatic vendettas. It requires hindsight. The viral framing of a hate list simplifies a more nuanced psychological journey. The shift from accommodation to articulation. When individuals reach a stage of life where professional survival is no longer precarious, they reassess boundaries. They may choose candor over diplomacy. But candor does not necessarily equate to public condemnation. Roberts' interviews in recent years reveal composure rather than volatility. She speaks about family, longevity, selective project choices. She emphasizes fulfillment outside relentless visibility. That posture contrasts sharply with the explosive rhetoric circulating online. Why, then, does the narrative persist? Because audiences crave narrative symmetry. The bright smile must conceal darkness. The beloved icon must harbor secret fury. The industry must produce villains. Stories without antagonists feel incomplete. Digital platforms reward escalation. Moderation does not trend. But the more compelling interpretation may be less theatrical. Perhaps Robert's story is not about 5 enemies, but about 5 phases: ascent, domination, scrutiny, recalibration, autonomy. Each phase required different tactics. Each phase altered her tolerance for compromise. When she was 23 and filming Pretty Woman, survival meant adaptability. When she was 33 and collecting awards, survival meant leverage. When she was 48 and producing projects, survival meant control. At 58, survival may simply mean clarity, choosing where to invest emotional energy and where to withdraw it. If there were tensions, they likely resemble what any high-performing professional encounters: clashes of ambition, misaligned incentives, bruised egos, and strategic distancing. Multiply that by global visibility and multi-million-dollar stakes, and emotional intensity scales accordingly. The myth of hatred may be a distortion of something subtler: disillusionment with systems rather than individuals. An understanding that charm does not negate competition. That praise can coexist with rivalry. That smiles on red carpets are often professional gestures, not declarations of intimacy. In that sense, the real revelation is not a list of names. It is the acknowledgement that enduring success requires emotional armor. And armor, once forged, can appear cold to those expecting perpetual warmth. The million-dollar smile remains. But behind it stands not a woman plotting revenge. Rather, a veteran who understands precisely how the game is played and who no longer needs to pretend otherwise. If parts 1 through 3 explored silence, power, and recalibration, then part 4 must confront something more uncomfortable: The emotional cost of myth-making. Long-term celebrity is not merely about talent or box office numbers. It is about narrative ownership. And for decades, Julia Roberts did not fully control the story told about her. She was framed through relationships, through headlines, through selective soundbites. The industry, and later the internet, constructed a character parallel to the real woman. That character was contradictory. She was America's sweetheart, yet difficult. She was charming, yet calculating. She was vulnerable, yet cold. Those contradictions were not accidental. They were commercially useful. A complex star sustains conversation. Conversation sustains relevance. But complexity without authorship can become distortion. By the late 2000s, Roberts had entered a phase where her name alone no longer guaranteed narrative control. Social media restructured fame. Publicists no longer moderated every storyline. Anonymous commentary flattened nuance. Viral clips extracted fragments from interviews and amplified them without context. In that environment, even a neutral expression could be interpreted as disdain. This is where the idea of resentment becomes psychologically plausible, not necessarily toward specific individuals, but toward the machinery that repeatedly simplifies human experience into spectacle. Consider the life cycle of a Hollywood rumor. A minor on-set disagreement becomes a blind item. The blind item becomes a speculative article. The article becomes a YouTube video. The video becomes common knowledge. Over time, repetition creates familiarity. Familiarity creates belief. For someone who built a career on emotional authenticity, who delivered performances rooted in vulnerability, the transformation into a caricature would feel destabilizing, especially when the caricature oscillates between saint and villain. There is also the dynamic of gendered memory. Male actors who age are described as evolving. Female actors who age are described as fading unless they actively redefine their narrative. Roberts chose selective visibility rather than omnipresence. That choice, while stabilizing personally, left interpretive gaps. Gaps invite projection. The viral storyline implies explosive grievances. But examine Roberts' career trajectory in the 2010s and beyond. She did not embark on a media campaign of accusation. She did not publish a scandal-driven memoir. She did not leverage controversy to relaunch herself. Instead, she stepped into projects aligned with her evolving interests. Independent films, streaming series, roles exploring psychological depth rather than romantic spectacle. That strategic quietness speaks volumes. It suggests a woman less interested in settling scores than in managing legacy. Legacy, however, is fragile. One viral allegation can distort decades of work. In the attention economy, sensationalism often outruns verification. This dynamic can produce a peculiar emotional state, frustration without outlet. To refute every rumor dignifies it. To ignore it risks tacit endorsement. This tension between correction and silence defines modern celebrity existence. Another dimension worth examining is proximity. The higher one climbs in an industry, the smaller the inner circle becomes. Trust narrows. Professional relationships may be cordial, but not intimate. When projects collapse or collaborations falter, the emotional impact intensifies because stakes are higher. A failed independent film for an unknown actor is disappointment. A failed prestige project for an A-list star can alter perception across global markets. The viral narrative describes betrayals as singular dramatic events. In reality, erosion is often gradual. A miscommunication here, a public comment there, a script revision without consultation. None individually catastrophic, but collectively cumulative. Over decades, those moments accumulate into caution. Caution can be misread as hostility. Roberts' public demeanor in later interviews, measured, occasionally wry, rarely impulsive, reflects someone who understands that every phrase may be dissected. That awareness changes how one speaks. The spontaneity of youth gives way to strategic articulation. Outsiders may interpret that evolution as distance or even contempt. It may simply be maturity. There is also the matter of competitive survival. Hollywood is finite at the top. Only a handful of actresses maintain A-list status across multiple decades. That longevity requires reinvention. Reinvention sometimes disrupts alliances. When an actress transitions from leading lady to producer, she competes differently. She evaluates scripts, negotiates budgets, influences casting. Power realignment can unsettle former peers. The human brain seeks narrative clarity. When observers see two high-profile individuals drift apart professionally, they often infer conflict. Sometimes there is none. Careers diverge. Priorities shift. Personal lives demand recalibration. By her late 50s, Roberts had achieved something rarer than awards: insulation, financial security, cultural permanence, the freedom to decline projects without fear of disappearance. That insulation changes one's relationship to criticism. It can reduce urgency. It can also heighten sensitivity to misrepresentation because there is less practical incentive to endure it silently. If she were to feel anger, it would likely stem not from petty rivalry, but from perceived exploitation of image, of trust, of personal boundaries. Yet even then, expression would be calibrated. A veteran understands the legal and reputational consequences of incendiary accusation. The mythology of a dramatic hate list thrives because it promises catharsis. Audiences project their own professional disappointments onto celebrity narratives. The fantasy that a powerful woman finally names those who wronged her satisfies a cultural appetite for confrontation. But catharsis rarely aligns with sustainable legacy management. In examining Roberts' trajectory, a more plausible interpretation emerges. Not explosive hatred, but strategic detachment. Not revenge, but selective collaboration. Not public condemnation, but private recalibration. Emotional resilience does not eliminate memory. It organizes it. The million-dollar smile endures not because it conceals fury, but because it reflects discipline. Discipline to separate performance from personal identity. Discipline to endure mischaracterization without reflexive rebuttal. Discipline to evolve while others freeze you in your most commercially useful era. In that sense, the most significant shift at 58 is not confession, it is autonomy. The autonomy to decide which stories are hers to tell and which are noise to be ignored. And perhaps that autonomy, more than any viral allegation, is what truly unsettles an industry accustomed to controlling its stars. If Part 4 was about autonomy, then Part 5 must confront something even more fundamental: control of narrative versus control of self. At the height of her fame, Julia Roberts was not simply acting in films. She was performing an identity that studios, media outlets, and audiences had collectively shaped. The smile became a brand. The laugh became a marketing device. Even vulnerability became a curated asset. When a public figure is transformed into intellectual property, disentangling the human being from the product becomes extraordinarily complex. The viral narrative frames her as someone who has finally decided to expose others. But exposure is not always about revealing secrets. Sometimes it is about reclaiming interpretive authority. The difference is critical. For decades, Roberts existed inside a feedback loop: performance, promotion, commentary, reaction. Every public interaction was filtered through commercial interests. Late-night interviews were strategic. Award show speeches were measured. Even silence was often advised. In that environment, resentment, if it ever existed, would not necessarily be directed at a single co-star or host. It could be directed at the architecture itself, the quiet understanding that one misstep could become a headline, that a private disagreement could be inflated into a feud, that professional assertiveness could be repackaged as arrogance. Consider the mechanics of image protection in the 1990s versus today. In the 1990s, publicists mediated almost every narrative. Today, digital platforms bypass traditional gatekeepers. A viral clip does not require verification to circulate globally. This structural shift changes the emotional calculus for legacy actors. The margin for misinterpretation narrows dramatically. Julia Roberts' generational position is unique. She straddled two eras, the analog celebrity machine and the algorithmic one. She learned to navigate controlled publicity before being thrust into decentralized exposure. That transition demands psychological adaptation. The viral script portrays a dramatic list of enemies, implying suppressed fury finally unleashed. Yet when evaluating Roberts' career longitudinally, a different pattern emerges: strategic withdrawal from environments that no longer align with her priorities. Withdrawal is not defeat. It is recalibration. After dominating romantic comedies, she did not chase endless sequels. After achieving Oscar recognition, she did not aggressively pursue awards campaigns year after year. Instead, she modulated visibility. She selected projects that allowed dimensionality rather than repetition. She prioritized family life over relentless output. Such choices often get misinterpreted as fading influence. In reality, they can represent the opposite: the ability to choose. Choice reduces dependency. Reduced dependency diminishes tolerance for disrespect. If she encountered professional behavior that crossed personal boundaries, whether creative marginalization, misrepresentation, or competitive maneuvering, her response may not have been public retaliation, but quiet non-participation. Refusal to collaborate again. Refusal to amplify tension. This is an under-discussed form of power, omission. In Hollywood, absence speaks. When two major stars cease appearing together, speculation ignites. But absence can stem from scheduling, creative divergence, or simple preference. Observers, however, often default to drama because drama satisfies narrative symmetry. There is also the emotional factor of endurance fatigue. Sustaining global visibility for over 3 decades requires constant energy expenditure. Emotional labor accumulates. Smiling through criticism, negotiating pay disparities, fielding invasive questions about personal life, all contribute to fatigue. Fatigue can sharpen boundaries. The concept of hatred, as presented in sensational storytelling, is theatrical. In mature adulthood, emotional responses often evolve into something more complex: disappointment, guardedness, pragmatic detachment. Hatred implies ongoing emotional investment. Detachment implies release. By 58, Roberts had little to gain from public vendettas. Her career was secured in cinematic history. Her financial standing insulated her from dependency. What remained at stake was reputation longevity. Reputation longevity requires consistency. It requires avoiding impulsive disclosures that could fracture decades of goodwill. If she ever addressed painful professional experiences, the articulation would likely be measured rather than incendiary. The viral framing also reflects a broader cultural appetite. Audiences crave moral clarity in ambiguous industries. Hollywood, as a symbol of glamour and excess, becomes a stage upon which viewers project frustration about inequality, hypocrisy, and power imbalance. When a respected figure appears to challenge that system, even rhetorically, it feels validating. Yet validation and verification are distinct. The deeper examination is not about whether she hates specific individuals. It is about how long-term fame restructures one's relationship to trust. Early in a career, trust may be expansive. Collaboration feels communal. As stakes rise, trust becomes selective. Each collaboration is evaluated not only for artistic merit, but for reputational safety. Trust, once recalibrated, rarely returns to its original naivety. Roberts' public evolution suggests someone who has internalized that lesson. Her interviews emphasize boundaries: creative boundaries, personal boundaries, media boundaries. She appears less interested in defending herself against every narrative and more invested in selective engagement. That posture can be misread as coldness. In truth, it may represent emotional efficiency. Energy is finite. Choosing where to expend it becomes strategic. The mythology of a dramatic hate list thrives because it promises spectacle. But spectacle is often incompatible with stability. For a figure seeking sustained legacy rather than viral resurgence, spectacle is risky. If there are individuals she no longer trusts, the evidence would likely be professional distance rather than televised denunciation. If there were moments that wounded her, those wounds have likely been metabolized privately rather than monetized publicly. The arc of her career reflects adaptation, not implosion. Reinvention, not revenge. And perhaps the most revealing transformation is this. At the beginning of her career, Julia Roberts had to convince Hollywood of her worth. At 58, she no longer does. That inversion shifts emotional dynamics profoundly. Approval becomes optional. Collaboration becomes conditional. Control of narrative ultimately intersects with control of self. The industry may construct myths, but the individual chooses response. Silence can be strategy. Speech can be strategy. Withdrawal can be strategy. The viral video frames revelation as confrontation. A more plausible interpretation frames revelation as perspective. The quiet recognition that not every smile requires reciprocation, not every collaboration warrants repetition, and not every wound deserves public excavation. The million-dollar smile remains intact, not because it conceals rage, but because it has learned to coexist with experience. And that coexistence, disciplined and selective, may be the most powerful statement of all. By the time someone reaches nearly 4 decades in a single industry, the story is no longer about individual conflicts. It becomes about pattern recognition. And if Part 5 examined narrative control, Part 6 must examine emotional evolution. There is a difference between reacting and recalibrating. In her 20s and 30s, Julia Roberts existed inside acceleration. Film after film, press tours, award cycles, romantic headlines, financial milestones. In that phase, momentum overrides introspection. You move forward because stopping feels dangerous. Every opportunity appears urgent. Every alliance appears essential. But longevity changes urgency. When you have already proven commercial viability, artistic credibility, and cultural impact, the pressure to tolerate friction diminishes. What once felt like part of the job begins to feel optional. Emotional tolerance narrows, not because of fragility, but because of clarity. Clarity about what you will accept. Clarity about what you will not. The viral narrative thrives on the idea of confrontation, of long-suppressed grievances finally detonating. Yet emotional maturity rarely detonates. It reorganizes. Reorganization often looks like distance. Notice how Roberts' public life in recent years reflects intentional boundaries. She does not overexpose herself on social platforms. She rarely engages in public feuds. She avoids reactionary commentary. That restraint is not accidental. It reflects someone who understands that visibility is a currency best spent selectively. Another factor is generational recalibration within Hollywood itself. The industry that shaped Roberts' early career operated with different norms. Power was more centralized. Agency influence was opaque. Public relations strategies were less transparent. Conversations about equity, consent, and workplace conduct were far less amplified. As cultural standards evolve, so too does retrospective interpretation. What was once normalized may later appear exploitative. What was once dismissed as personality conflict may later be recognized as systemic imbalance. For someone who has navigated both eras, emotional processing becomes layered. There may be experiences that felt merely frustrating in 1998 but feel unacceptable by 2025 standards. That shift does not require hatred. It requires hindsight. Hindsight can be sobering. There is also the psychological reality of fame fatigue. Constant scrutiny reshapes self-perception. When headlines repeatedly simplify you, hero, villain, diva, sweetheart, the internal desire to correct the record can intensify. Yet constant correction is exhausting. Eventually, some public figures choose not to fight every misrepresentation. They let narratives cycle without participation. That decision is not surrender. It is efficiency. If Julia Roberts ever harbored disappointment toward colleagues, the more likely trajectory would be internal resolution rather than public retaliation. High-functioning professionals often convert resentment into boundary refinement. They choose future collaborations more carefully. They negotiate more precisely. They disengage from environments that compromise dignity. Disengagement is not dramatic. It is quiet. The audience, however, craves drama. The idea of a powerful woman finally naming names satisfies a desire for moral theater. But theater and truth are not identical. Truth is frequently anticlimactic. Another dimension worth acknowledging is gratitude complexity. Long careers generate both appreciation and frustration. Roberts has benefited enormously from Hollywood. She has also endured its distortions. It is possible to feel both gratitude and disillusionment simultaneously. Human emotion is not binary. At 58, her public tone suggests integration rather than eruption. Integration of ambition and family. Integration of legacy and privacy. Integration of confidence and restraint. If there were moments when she felt undermined or misrepresented, those moments have likely been metabolized into wisdom rather than weaponized into spectacle. The viral script positions anger as the climactic reveal. But what if the more significant reveal is something subtler? Detachment from the need for approval. Detachment from constant validation. Detachment from reputational panic. When someone no longer depends on universal affection, they operate differently. They can decline invitations. They can refuse scripts. They can avoid collaborations without explanation. They can allow rumors to dissipate without response. That is not coldness. That is insulation. Insulation comes from experience, from financial independence, from cultural permanence. Few actors reach that stage. Fewer still maintain composure within it. So perhaps part 6 is not about enemies at all. It is about evolution from reaction to calibration, from seeking acceptance to defining standards, from navigating Hollywood's machinery to standing slightly outside it. The million-dollar smile remains, but now it belongs to someone who understands exactly when to use it and when to let silence speak instead. By the time a career stretches across nearly 4 decades, the question is no longer who hurt you, but what did you learn? At 58, Julia Roberts does not resemble someone waiting to settle scores. She resembles someone who has already done the internal accounting. The early hunger, the mid-career dominance, the scrutiny, the reinvention, all of it forms a trajectory that feels less like a revenge arc and more like a study in endurance. The viral narrative insists on 5 names. It insists on confrontation. It insists on spectacle. But spectacle is rarely the final chapter for those who truly understand power. Power, at its highest level, is restraint. When Roberts first stepped into Hollywood, she was navigating systems larger than herself: studio hierarchies, media framing, agency politics. She had to adapt quickly. She had to learn when to speak and when to withhold. She had to balance authenticity with diplomacy. Those lessons do not disappear with age. They compound. If there were moments of betrayal, disappointment, or professional friction, they now exist within a broader emotional landscape. With time, intensity softens into perspective. What once felt catastrophic may now register as instructive. What once felt personal may now feel structural. There is something revealing about how Roberts carries herself in recent interviews. She does not project bitterness. She projects selectivity. She speaks about family, about creative curiosity, about choosing projects that align with her current self rather than her past persona. That shift is significant because ultimately, the most powerful move in an industry built on visibility is knowing you no longer need it in the same way. The idea of hatred makes for clickable headlines, but hatred implies ongoing emotional entanglement. And nothing about Julia Roberts' current posture suggests entanglement. It suggests completion. A woman who has already extracted what she needed from the system and is now engaging with it on her own terms. Perhaps the most important transformation is this. Early in her career, the industry defined her. Mid-career, she negotiated with it. Now, she stands adjacent to it, participating but not dependent. That is not the climax audiences expect. It is quieter than that, but it is stronger. The million-dollar smile that once symbolized Hollywood fantasy now symbolizes something else: longevity. Survival without collapse. Success without implosion. A sustained presence in an industry notorious for discarding its icons. If there are stories she will never tell, that silence is deliberate. If there are names she will never mention, that omission is intentional. Not because she is afraid, not because she is seething, but because she no longer needs the catharsis. And perhaps that is the real revelation at 58. Not who she hates, but how little she needs to prove.